In this video, we're going to focus on how the metal ring, the casing of the watch, was created in flame. Not only the modeling of the actual shape, but also how the PBR textures were applied to it to give it a specific look. We'll also look at the lighting, how we use the lights in flame to light it in a certain way, and how to use the camera effects depth of field. Just as before, we're going to create a clean action, a brand new action, and start from that. Hit the tilde key to go into the action schematic. From our node bin, let's add a 3D shape. We're going to use the delete tool to delete the axis and the Gmask on the bottom. And then select the 3D shape node. Down in the node bin, hit the G key. And then drag a Gmask ellipse into the schematic. F4 for a result. Hold the Alt and the Shift keys down and click and drag to create our ellipse shape. By default, we have our white mask, a closed Gmask shape, but we want to make this an open Gmask. So I'll zoom in to the very top of our Gmask, hit the A key to access our Add Points tool. We'll add one vertice right to the left of the original vertice at the center by clicking on the edge of it. And then down in the parameters, we'll click the object option to access its parameters. Make sure profile is the currently selected parameters and come over to the spline option and disable the closed option. This is now an open shape. Now we want to add a gradient to the shape, so I'll hit the A key once again to get our add points mode. Then while holding the Shift key, click on the Gmask edge and drag out. Now it is technically a 3D shape, and if we want to rotate it to see it, let's go back to the schematic, make sure our axis is selected, and then back in the result view, if we adjust our X rotation, you can see we have our shape now. Go Node Preferences, Rendering, activate the shading option, and set the value to 100% as we've done before. Disable the Node Preferences. Go back to the schematic, select the 3D shape, go to the basic parameters for the object, where we have our extrusion option. Set the depth to be 50. Then go to the profile menu. Similar to what we've done before, we're going to adjust our angle and our curvature. First, we'll adjust our angle. And as you make the adjustment, you'll see the graph changes, plus obviously our shape changes. For now, I'll set the angle to about 30, and then we'll go down to our curvature. When you start to adjust the curvature, you'll see again the graph and your shape is changing. And then by adjusting our angle and our curvature, we can model the shape that we want this to be. I'll set the angle at 35 and our curvature at 0.50 to give us a torus shape. Let's go back to the action schematic. Hold the Alt key and select the top axis, which selects all the nodes. Then hit Control D, which will duplicate it. Select the new axis on the top that we just duplicated and click the Reset button down below to reset all of its parameters. Then we'll take the original top axis and use that as a parent to this axis. So click off that axis and connect it to our newly duplicated axis. Select the 3D shape in our newly duplicated object. Now let's hit F4 to go back to our result view. And then holding the Control key, click in the angle and the curvature parameters for the bevel to reset them. Go back to the schematic again, select the top axis for this shape. I'll drag it down to -58. Go back to the schematic, select our 3D shape again, and then let's go to the basic settings for this object and change the depth for our extrusion for this shape to be 120. Once again, select its axis. We want to line it up with the other geometry, so I'll set the Z position to -63. Go back to our schematic again. We want to duplicate our first geometry again. Then we'll add a new axis to this 3D geometry. And then once again, we want to parent this to our main axis. Select the axis that we just added, and we want to scale that. Now select the new axis we just duplicated for our geometry, and we want to scale that down. Bring it to a parameter somewhere around 87. And now we want to change the bevel parameters for this. So let's go back to the schematic, select the 3D geometry. We want to make this shape a little more triangular, not as curved. So bring the curvature down to 0. And we'll lower the angle also. Bring it to about 27. And we can see the profile changing in our end result. Now we want to position it, so let's go back to the schematic, select the axis controlling this shape. We want to lower this down in our Z position. So I'll bring the Z position to -15, and we want to scale it a little bit. Then let's select the main axis for all the shapes, and then we can rotate it in the view to see what we've created. Now it's time to start assigning some materials to it. Select the first 3D shape, go back to our node bin, hit the S key with your cursor over the node bin, double click on Substance PBR. The Substance PBR options appear. Right now we're looking at the metal PBR substance presets. Select the metal steel preset. We've now assigned the material to our first shape. Hit F4 to go back and look at the result view. Now we can see that object is black. It has that material applied to it. Let's add some materials to the other objects. We're going to repurpose this Substance PBR to both the other shapes. So click off each one of the 3D shape nodes and drag and connect it to the material node. And then we need to connect our shader to those same geometries. So hit the L key to get your light link tool. Click off the shader and attach it to each one of the 3D shapes. When we hit F4 to look at our result, we can see that everything is black. And we're not seeing anything yet. Let's hit the M key to go back to our select tool. That's because we need to add some lights. So let's go back to our schematic view, come down to our node bin, hit the L key, drag a light into our scene, double click on the light. With the light selected, let's go down to its parameters, and on the basic settings, let's change the light type to ambient. Now hit F4 for the result again. You can see that it's currently gray. It's now being lit by this light. Let's go back to the schematic. We want to duplicate that light. Again, Control D with the light selected, duplicates it. The second light is going to be used for a dramatic look and controlling the reflections. With this new light selected, let's go to the end result and let's position it far off to the right side. Our geometry is still currently gray because of the texture that's applied to it. Let's go back to our schematic and let's select the Substance PBR material. Then go to the Advanced Settings. And then we'll change the steel color to black. Hit F4 once again. Now we can see that our metal material is black and we've got some defects in it that's part of the Substance PBR. Let's add an IBL to the action setup. So go back to the schematic. In the schematic, select our camera. Let's go down to our node bin. With the cursor over the node bin, hit the I key and let's drag an IBL and attach it to our camera. Now hit F4 to look at the end result. Now the image-based lighting is visible and we can see how it's affecting our geometry. But we want to change this to look more like studio lights being cast down onto the objects. And we want to change the texture a little bit. For the IBL, this is the default texture, but we want to change that. Down in the parameters with objects selected, go to the read file. You'll see the load button that's available for the texture that's being used. Also, we can create our own in batch. So let's go back to the batch schematic by hitting the escape button. Let's add another action node that we're going to use to create the IBL texture image. Let's go into the schematic for our new action node. From our node bin, let's add a 3D shape into the schematic. Delete the default Gmask and its axis. Select the 3D shape. Come down to the node bin. Hit the G key. Add a Gmask rectangle. In the result view, click and drag to create a rectangle mask. Something that looks like this. Now go back to the batch schematic view and select our original action tool and create a new input. So Control N to add a layer. Then connect the output of the action that we just created our Gmask in as the main input for our other action node. Go to the result view for our action node. We can see that that image has been added as a layer. We want to delete it, so with the D key, we'll just click and delete it and its axis. Hit the M key to go back to your select tool. Make sure the image, the media that we just brought in, is selected in your media list. And then also make sure you have selected the IBL source attached to the camera. Then come down to the parameters and click the Apply button. Hit F4 to go back to our result view, and now you can see the effect of the IBL light has changed because of the image we've just applied to it. Hit the Escape key to go back to our batch schematic. Hold the equal key down and click on our action node. This will bring up the View Context menu. Select Context 2. Now we see the C2 in parentheses for this action. We know this is now context 2 as far as viewports. Now hit the spacebar and your 2 key, and now we're looking at the end result of that action in this context view. Hit the Escape key to go back to our batch schematic and select the new action we created with that Gmask in it. Go into its schematic, select the main axis for this 3D shape. Now hit the spacebar 2 again, and we can see the context of our action with our model in it, but we can access the actual Gmask from the other action. Go to the Object tab for this axis, which is controlling our 3D shape and the Gmask. And now as I change the X position for the axis, you can see how it's affecting our geometry because it's an image that is applied to our IBL. Let's go back to the action schematic, where our mask and our 3D geometry is, and we want to duplicate this. So select the top axis with the Alt key or Option, which selects all our nodes, hit Control D to duplicate everything. Now go into the result view with the top axis of our duplication selected, and then shift it over to the right with the X parameter. With this axis still selected, hit the spacebar and the 2 key. We go back to the context view of our end result of our main action, and we can start to move this Gmask and 3D shape around to see how it is affecting our geometry. And this mimics now having 2 different light sources, such as in a studio. Let's go back to the action schematic for our Gmask shapes. And let's add an axis in here and connect it to the 2 main axes. So now we have one control for both the geometries. Now switching between the schematic, where we have our 2 pieces of geometry we're using as our lights, and then hitting spacebar 2 to look at the end result of the main action, I can position and adjust the location of these to create the effect that I want. Let's go back to our main action. So I'll go back out to the batch schematic, select it, and then hit the F4 key to go look at the end result of this. So go back into the schematic now for this action. This image here is the reflection texture that's part of our Substance PBR. And we want to change the image that it's using, that's applied to it. So to do that, we're going to go back out to our batch schematic, hit Escape, and we're going to use a substance noise. So hit the S key with your cursor over our node bin for batch. Drag the substance noise to the batch schematic. In the substance noise preset folder, select the caustic substance noise, the 3rd one from the left. With that selected, I'll hit the F4 key so you can see what this texture is. It's a procedural generated texture. Let's add a color corrector to the end of that. Hit F4 with the color correction selected to see the end result. We'll decrease the gain. I'll enter a value of 20 for the gain to really darken it up. Select our main action node once again and hit Control N to create a new input. And connect the end result of our color correction as the main input for our new layer, our new input. Let's go back into our action schematic and make sure you select the reflection texture for our material. And then make sure our new texture image that we just brought in is selected and click the Apply button. You'll see the thumbnail, the icon update. Let's delete the surface and the axis that was brought in when we brought in that texture. Now hit F4 for the result, and you can see the reflection taking place on the geometry. I want to scale it, so let's go back to the action schematic, select the axis for that texture, Then back in the result view, as we make our adjustments to our scale, we can see how it's affecting it. Let's increase the scale to a value of 1,300. This will scale up the image, obviously, but then also soften the effect of the reflection on the geometry. Now, if we zoom in, we can see we've got some dirt or some defects happening inside this material. We want to soften that or remove that. To do that, let's go back into our schematic and select our Substance PBR. You'll see the dirt parameter. We want to decrease this. I'll set this to 0, so we remove the dirt from this material. Now we want to adjust the intensity for this material. So let's go to the basic parameters for this Substance PBR. You'll see the normal intensity parameter down on the bottom here. I'm going to drag it and increase it to number 1. With that increased to value of 1, you can see the detail of it on the geometry. Also, let's go back to our schematic really quickly. Select the light number 2. Let's set this light to be a point spotlight. Now as we increase the intensity for this point spotlight, you'll see the details on our model become much more visible. Go back to our schematic for a second and select the main axis. Go back to the end result view. And now as I rotate the shape on the X, you can see how the lighting between the IBL lights and our normal lights are affecting the geometry. Now we want to add some depth of field to this scene. Let's go back to our schematic view once again by hitting the tilde key. Select our default camera. Go to our node bin down below. Let's go to the Matchbox tab. And with your cursor over the Matchbox node bin, hit the S key and then drag a Stingray depth of field camera effects into the scene. Let's hit F4 once again. We can now see the depth of field is starting to affect our scene. Let's go back to our schematic and select our main axis for a second. Back to the result view. And on the Object tab, adjust the Z position so our geometry is closer to our camera. Now you can see the effect of the depth of field at its default settings, whereas it's blurrier in the front, what is closer to the camera, and much clearer or in focus in the back end of our geometry. Now I want to adjust or actually flip the focus and what's blurred. We want the back end of our geometry blurred and the focus be in the front. So back in the schematic, I'll select our Stingray depth of field. Go back to our end result. We can now change the focus of our depth of field by changing the position of it. If I drag the Z position to the right and increase its value, bringing it up to about 1200, you can see we've now changed what is in focus, which is now the front of our geometry. I'll increase it even more, taking it above 1300. We can also change the blur effect by going under the fall off settings and increasing or decreasing our far max. I'm going to increase it. I'll drag it up to over 5 just for demonstration, but you can see how blurred the back end of our geometry is now. But I'll bring the value down to about 2. I'm going to change the texture now that we're zoomed in on this geometry. So let's go back to our schematic and select our Substance PBR once again. Go to its texture parameters, and you'll see the texture resolution. By default, it's at 1024 by 1024. Click on that and let's increase that. Let's set it to 2048 by 2048, which will be a higher resolution texture, obviously. Now we see our details have increased. You can take it all the way up to 4096 by 4096 if you needed to, and you'll have even more detail. But 2048 is enough for us, so let's go back and set that to be our texture resolution. Now back in the schematic, select our main axis and go back to the result view. Now as we change the position of our geometry in the Z, you can see the result of the depth of field and the texture and the lighting, everything that we've created up to this point. You can rotate the object and see the result, all because of our action setup. If you want to control the lights that are on this shape, go back to our action schematic and select the image we're using on our IBL. And then down in the parameter settings, go to the controls for this IBL, and you can see the gain value that we can start to adjust. By increasing or decreasing it, we see the effect of the IBL light on our geometry. Or we can go back into the schematic and select our reflection texture once again. Go back to our end result, and now we have the effects slider that we can start to adjust. And of course, we can always use our lights, the positioning of the lights, the intensity of the light. Let me select light number 1. Go back to our end result. You can adjust the intensity of this light, and of course, this is going to affect the way the geometry looks. Or go back and select the second light, which is a spotlight that is further away from the geometry. Again, adjusting its intensity, we'll see the end result on our geometry. You'll really see a lot of the effect with this light on the reflections and the details that are on the metal image. So that's going to end this video.